everyone. But so starting off quickly, what is React? React's an open source front-end JavaScript library. What that means is, for those of you who have ever made web applications with HTML, JavaScript, CSS, that sort of thing, this is an attempt to combine those together in a way that makes it easier to develop web applications. One of the ways it does that is by approaching the problem using components. A couple of the benefits of that is components have a very simple life cycle. What that means is if I have a piece of code that needs to do something when it starts and do something when it ends, that's very easy to do with React components. It's very similar to normal JavaScript and HTML, so it doesn't necessarily require a lot of additional information to get familiar with React and become proficient with it over just what would normally be required for a basic website. They're very easily testable. Testing is something that many people don't necessarily start considering while they're still in college. It's something that becomes more of a problem in industry, but it's always a good idea to get ahead of that. If you can learn anything about testing, it's always very useful. And React components are very easy to test. And then it also implements a consistent one-way data binding. We'll get into that in the next slide, but basically what that means is it's very easy to tell where data is. And this whole talk will mostly be using information from reactjs.org. If anyone wants to get a little bit serious about React, that's a really good place to kind of start. It has really good information. Actually, I'm going to bring it up onto the screen quickly. So this is kind of the basic React information place to go. There's documentation. There are really easy tutorials. They're all listed right here. The classic hello world, getting started, that sort of thing. Some of the demo we're going to do a little later was actually taken basically straight from the site. So really heavily recommend checking this out if you get into React. So components in React, what's so useful about them is it really focuses on the ideas of being able to reuse parts of the component, abstract out functionality. So if I have something that, in this case, I have a bunch of code that's making a contact page, I can break that up into smaller pieces that makes it easier to understand. Again, the demo a little later will show this more obviously, but just think, instead of one file with 1,000 lines of code, I might have 10 files with 100 lines or smaller than that. It makes it easier to tell what's going on rather than having to find it all in this one big file. And then data is also passed very easily through this. So if you tell by the arrows, just imagine the arrows are just data being transferred between components. One of the nice things is if I have something in contact card, some data, I know that data is coming from whatever the parent component is, and so on and so forth. So it makes finding issues really easy. I'm sure everyone's had issues where they're writing code and something goes wrong and it takes a while to figure out what the problem even is. One of the nice things about React is it's usually a little faster to find the problem. And then, like I mentioned before, why not React? React is great, but it can be a little bloated. There's some extra setup you have to go through. Even though I said it's very similar to vanilla, just normal JavaScript and HTML, you still do need a little bit more experience and a little bit of information to get started with it. And the truth is, not every website needs that. There are websites that they're very static. They're just trying to show some information, maybe like a very simple blog, that sort of thing, where you don't need the extra functionality that React gives you. And then also, if the user doesn't have JavaScript enabled, React will not work at all. You will just get a page saying, please enable JavaScript to see this application. It's normally not a huge issue. Most people have JavaScript enabled nowadays, but it is an issue to consider. And then demo time. So for this demo, we're kind of breaking it into two parts. We're going to go through a little bit of live code, some basic React tutorials just to get everyone up to speed. And then Hunter is going to continue off with the portfolio website that we're going towards building in this GBM. So to get
font size,
yeah, let me do that.
Does this browser not support control scroll wheel?
It does, but I'm just going to increase the font size across the board. Let's do 18. Sorry about this. The normal font, we'll do 20. color scheme font 20. There we go. Can everyone kind of read this? See everything that's going on?
Good.
Cool. So to get started, what I was saying before with React being kind of complicated to set up, there is honestly a lot that goes on behind the scenes. Luckily, with React, you don't necessarily need to know a lot of what goes on behind the scenes. There is a way to start a project that's called Create React App. In the console, you can just type a simple command that boots up a whole project for you. Now, to do that, you do have to have something called npm installed, Node Package Manager. I don't want to get too far into that. Just know that it's a tool in your command line that you can install. It has a lot of use outside of just React, but just for the sake of this tutorial, if you want to get started with React, you just look up something like npm install, and you can see that there are ways to install npm. So I'll be doing some commands in my terminal that use this, but just know that's all that is. Okay. So when I create a basic React application, it'll look something like this in this 0, where there's going to be a couple of folders. Is it too small still? Here. Size, console font, editor tabs. Actually, I don't know how to make that bigger. Oh well. So this is what a basic React project looks like, though, where there's src, which means source, and then public. We're not going to worry too much about the default files in here at first, because there's a lot happening and it can get a little confusing. Just know that when you create a React project using that npm create React app that I mentioned before, it will look something like this. So we created some bite-sized demo projects. In this first one, Hello World, if we go into source, there's only this one file here. In this one file, this is all of the code. So to get started, we have to import certain libraries to write React. And this can be one of the more difficult parts, because sometimes it's difficult to know, well, if I want to use this bit of code or write this bit of code, what should I import? And this is where having a good editor comes in. VS Code is a good choice for those of you who use VS Code. I like using WebStorm. It's a JetBrains product. We get it for free through the school. And of course, there are other options. Those are just kind of some of the popular ones. But in this case, to render a React page, so okay. So to start a React page like this, you can see that this page only shows Hello World. And that's because we're only rendering this little bit of text right here, Hello World. And for those of you familiar with HTML or JavaScript, you should recognize this. This is called a tag. In basic HTML, this is just it's displaying the text in a certain way. So in this case, H1 means it's a header tag. It's just going to make it look really big. If I change this to like H3, it's going to make it look a little smaller. And for those of you who have programmed before yes, so you have to install Node. And actually, yeah, I'll get back to that in a second. Sorry. So this is where combining HTML and JavaScript is really useful. Normally, if I wanted to create a page like this with HTML and JavaScript, they'd have to be separate files. But in here, you can actually write the HTML inside of the JavaScript. This is kind of the React syntax, the way React tends to look, combining these things together. So what we're doing is we're rendering on the page using this HTML tag. And that's all this is doing. It's nothing more complicated than that. Starting it, like I said, starting it can be a little complicated. That has to do with the npm stuff we talked about. There are basic commands. Again, don't get too confused with the different commands. All you guys need to know is when you start these projects, you would go into the directory and you have to install the libraries. So that's just npm install. And then once it installs whatever it needs to install, it usually takes a second. Once it's done installing, we can just start it up by doing npm start. So those two commands are really all you need to know to do most of the basic React projects. Just install to get started, and then start to start it up. And again, it takes a little bit. And then npm start. One of the nice things about React and starting a website like this is any changes that are made are automatically refreshed. So you don't have to constantly start things up, stop them. For those of you who have basic programming experience with other projects, you're constantly having to stop them and start them up. And that can be kind of annoying. With this, if I make a change, let's say I change this to H1 just to make the text look bigger, it automatically rebuilds for me. And it is bigger. Or if I were to use P, maybe some of you who have used HTML might be more familiar with the P tag or the div tag. Just mostly different ways of organizing things. That'll change how this looks as well. So actually small. Yes, the fact that this builds while you're working on it is extremely convenient. Okay, so let's get a little more complicated. So you can see here, this is just how I render some basic HTML on the page. If I go to this second one, it starts to get a little more complicated. So you see here, we have a few more files. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to say ignore the .css files. For those of you who aren't familiar with web development, just know that's just what styles things. It makes them look a certain way. So it's something you could ignore at first and until you're more comfortable with what you're doing. So for now, we're just going to pretend the .css files don't exist. So if I go back to this file, index.js, you can see that I'm importing a few more libraries, and I'm rendering stuff. But there's a little bit more going on here. I wouldn't worry again too much about exactly what's how like this React syntax. Just the important part to get out of this is app. So here I'm importing something called app, which is a file. It's right here, app.js, into this one. And I can actually render it right here. So when I start this up, take a second, start development server, it loads this, and it looks all fancy and stuff. But there's no actual HTML being displayed here. And the reason for that is app is a component. It's a separate file and a separate function we've created that does certain things inside of it. And that's so we can kind of break down functionality. So this is just here to render things on the web page, and then the app is just here for this basic display. And the reason I'm explaining it like this is if you remember back to what I started with, when you do the create React app, which is the way most projects are going to be started, and the way that if you're experimenting, you're going to experiment with, that's actually exactly what this looks like. So if you see here, the default one, there's some extra stuff going on. Again, don't worry too much about that, but it's rendering this app component. And then if you go there, there's just a bunch of code being rendered. So these demos are kind of building towards that basic explaining what everything is actually doing. So if we go back to ours, which is kind of cut down a little bit, you can see here we have some function named app. And then in that app, we're returning some HTML. And this is how a lot of React components are broken down. There's the JavaScript, and then it'll return whatever HTML. And HTML is just kind of what's going to end up being displayed on the page here. So there's a div, there's a header, and there's an image, and there's a p tag. So a general rule of thumb is div tags are just organization. They're just ways to divide pieces so you kind of understand what's going on. Header is basically the same thing. This could be named div and nothing would actually change. For basic purposes at least. But here is img. It's an image tag. So if I want to load an image on the page, in this case, this kind of rotating React logo, that's how I load that. So if I delete this line, you can see here, image disappears. If I put that back, image appears. if you want a little bit more to become a little bit more familiar with this is HTML specific. So you can, if you go through a basic HTML tutorial, this should all look very familiar to you. And luckily, HTML is relatively easy to learn. So that's kind of one of the nice parts about that. And then here we have a p tag, which again is just basically a way to organize this, at least for demo purposes. I could delete these, and I could just write this directly here. And it would look a little bit messier, but again, very similar. Yes, please. I know this can be all very confusing. I have a decent amount of experience with React, so sometimes I tend to skip over things that I think might be a little obvious, but really are not obvious, just because I've been working with it for a little bit. This is totally new territory for a lot of you. Please feel free to ask questions.
One thing, why is it class name and not class like a normal HTML?
Yes, so great question. So for those of you who are familiar with HTML, you'll know that when you're so class has to do with the CSS files I mentioned before that kind of are how things look like. So for those of you familiar with HTML, it's not actually class name, it's just class. So this is one of the small differences in React and something that you have to get a little used to. There are certain changes. Even though I keep saying that this is basically just HTML, it's not actually HTML. There are going to be small changes. One of those changes is if you want to style a component or part of the component, it's class name, not just class. Another one is, and we'll actually show a little later, there are certain things you can do in this HTML code that you aren't actually able to do in normal HTML. So there are those small changes that they can be confusing at first. If I just write class, it gives me an error. And again, that's kind of one of the advantages of having a good good code editor, whether that be Visual Studio Code or whatever you're using. It'll tell you what the error is. So here I can see, oh, class isn't an attribute that exists. So that's how I might know, well, maybe I have to look up why is class not working in React, and that's how I'd see that it's actually class name. So this is just, like I said, there's the index file that's just rendering this on the page, and it's just rendering a component app that we've created, imported. And this just has a very basic HTML, bit of HTML being returned. So if we stop that and go into the next kind of upgraded tutorial, you'll see starting at the top, we have index that looks very similar. Everything is about the same as before. And you'll notice I keep starting with index. Most React projects have index as their top level file, this index.js. So if you're ever looking at a React project, you don't know where to start, this is a good place to start. So from here I can see, okay, this is the top level. This is what's being rendered on the page for everyone to see. Oh, and here's this app component that's what's being displayed. So I can go over to app, and here's app, but it looks a little different. You'll notice it, like before, it's a function named app. I'm returning some bit of HTML in here. It's going to be in a div tag just to be organized. It's this header tag, again, just organization. But this is what's different. What's example component? Well, that's another component that I've created and imported into here. So if I go to example component, this is returning a bit of HTML that is rendering what's on the page. So this is an example of how you might start creating smaller components to do certain things. And here it's just named example component, but if it was more realistic, I might name it something like spinning or logo component or whatever it is. If it's a bit of code that has to do with the logo or whatever it is, it just makes it easy to read and easy to organize these different pieces together. The purpose of this, though, is if you remember earlier, we were talking about data flow in components, transferring data from one component down to the next one. So those are actually called props. So here, when I call the component that I've imported, that's the example component, I can actually pass values into it. So in this case, I can pass a value called name. And that value can be whatever I want to pass into it. So in this case, I can pass in the value Dakota. And then in that example component, I can access it. So here you can say, I'm saying I'm passing some props in, and then you would access them by the name of that prop. So here I'd say, hello, props.name. How are you today? So in that case, it's, I need to start this up. npm start. There we go. So here you go. It says, hello, Dakota. How are you today? But maybe I can pass a different value and I can say, how about Hunter? I can change that. And again, like I said, it just reloads really quickly and it says, hello, Hunter. How are you today? Or Andrew or whoever I want to pass that value in. So you can see that this value is being passed in. And if for some reason there's some error with that value, is it always props? How does JS know that contains our data? That's a great question. This is actually one of the limitations of JavaScript. It doesn't necessarily know. So in here, I write props.name. And the reason I can do that is I'm passing in a prop named name. And in here, I'm saying there are values being passed in as props. And I can access that by props dot whatever the value of what's being passed in. But in here, I don't actually know that I'm passing in name. I, as a person, know that that exists because I am passing in something called name. But in here, I don't necessarily know that. So I could do props dot hello. But it'll just give me a warning. It'll say, well, hold on. Hello is a variable that doesn't exist. It's not being passed in. Or I could type anything, right? So, bye, Julia. So the only reason I know that exists is because I'm passing in something called name.
The name props is arbitrary for this because it's just the first argument, but it's normally the name that you would see. And if you see some, we might later show some where it's gets more advanced JavaScript where you'll see it destructured. So if you look up object destructuring, you'll see that too. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. So the name props is arbitrary, and actually, I don't even need this. I could pass in. I could say I'm passing in name or a value called name, and just access that directly. Oh, hold on. I have to put in curly braces. If you're passing in a single value, it would have to be in curly braces. So here you go, Andrew. And actually, as a good example, I'm passing in name here, but what if I want to pass in more props? I can say second name, and I put the second name equal to Dakota. I'm sorry, can you guys hear the dog barking?
We can, but it's all right.
It's my roommate's dog. Anyways, so here I'm passing in two props, one name, one name, second name. So in here, I could, like before, just write props, or if I wanted to be more specific, I could write name and second name. And then in the H bit of HTML, I can say, hello, name, how are you today? And then also, I don't like second name. So I do that. I don't like Dakota. That pops up in there. And you might notice in here, if I'm using a variable, I have to put it in these curly braces. That's just so I can put a variable into the HTML. And actually, it's kind of an easy way to tell if something's a variable. If it's a variable, it'll be in these curly braces. Hopefully it's not too complicated. Like I said, I know there's a lot going on. We're ignoring some parts of the code, but for props, they don't really get too much more complicated than that. It can get a little hard if you have a lot of components because maybe maybe the value starts at the very top and is passed down through like 5 or 6 components. Then it can get a little tricky sometimes, but that's about it. Only a couple left. So we're gonna go to state and events. So even more complicated React concepts. So if I go into state and events, I'm gonna start this project up. You can see in here, I have my source file I'm going into. This is where all the functional code really is. So that's why I'm going to here. Like always, I start with index.js because that's the top. I'm sorry, 1 second, guys.
While he's gone, does anyone have any questions so far?
I had one.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what tutorials you guys would recommend online to get into this kind of stuff, because obviously this is just a very cursory overview. So if we want to go deeper, what resources would you recommend?
So the actual reactjs.org website he mentioned is a good starting place because that's like the official documentation, and they actually have some like deeper like dives into different sections. As you can see, there's like advanced guides and different things like that. They have more tutorials. Other than that, we'll just make a list of tutorials and we'll send that out later too. Dakota, do you have any other tutorials that you've used in the past, or?
Mostly just trial and error.
Another thing is if you're looking for just like if you not just React, but if you want a more JavaScript tutorial, that site that I sent in the chat, which with the destructuring, is Mozilla's documentation for JavaScript, and that's like the best source you can find on all the different ways in like JavaScript. So like any new syntax or anything is going to be on there, and it's great.
Yeah, and that's one of the nice things with React. A lot of this, if you know if someone in here knows JavaScript very well and knows HTML, this should all look very familiar. The only difference being there's a little bit of it that's React specific. Like React DOM isn't something that exists in normal JavaScript. But for the most part, a lot of these ideas, a lot of the code is very similar to normal JavaScript. So you can learn that, and that's a skill that's very useful, not just for React, but for other websites or even a couple of other different frameworks that are options you can use. So yeah, there's a lot of things you can do. But okay, so state and events. So like I said before, top level is that index.js file. It's always a good idea to start there just so you kind of know at the very top level what's going on. Here we see, again, there's a component named app that's being rendered. I can just go to that. But in here, you'll see the code's a little different. So this is getting into something called state in React. State and props are very closely related. So if I have some value in here, let's just say it's a variable named bad clicks. And for those of you not familiar with JavaScript, let is just a way to say this is going to be a variable. It might be an integer, it might be a string. I don't know. It's going to be whatever it's going to be. In this case, I set it equal to 0, so it's an integer. And then here, I create something called clicks and set clicks with this use state function. This is how you create state in React. It's something you have to import. It's something you have to import, and it's an alternate to creating normal variables. And this is where React as a framework really shines. And one of the reasons we use React is so we can use state. So in the code, I have two buttons. This first button and the second button. Let's look at the second button first. So in the second button, we're gonna create this button. This looks like HTML, and then there's this thing called onClick. So all these HTML tags have different attributes you can add, different things that can happen. So in here I wrote onClick. If I write on, you can see there's a lot of events I can link to this tag specific, this button. So on abort, on animation end, on animation start capture. There's a bunch of them. You don't really need to know most of them. I've used React a lot and I haven't used most of these. They're just some kind of very common ones like on click or on change. So in this case, we're going to use on click. So what this means is if somebody clicks the button, so on the click, it's going to do this little bit of code, or it's going to execute this little bit of code. In this case, I'm saying I want bad clicks to add 1 to itself. So if I click this button, you can see nothing's happening. The reason why is because even though bad clicks is increasing, so I believe did I print that out to the console? I don't. Well, so bad clicks is increasing, but the page isn't re-rendering. And this is a problem that you'd have with most static websites. If I'm updating these values without refreshing the page isn't going to display these refreshed values. And that's where state comes into play. So here I have another button. It looks very similar because it's almost the exact same. The only difference is I'm going to use those state things I created up above. Clicks and set clicks. This kind of way of writing it where I have the variable and then set the name of the variable is the common way to do it. So not just for clicks, if I had friends, like say I was making a social media application, I was setting their friends, like the amount of friends they have, I could say friends and then set friends. They don't technically need to be written this way. It's just kind of the common way of writing it, so it's very obvious what's going on. So here I can say on clicking this button, I want to set the number of clicks to clicks plus 1. If I do that, you can see it updates, and it keeps updating. The reason why is because whenever state updates, it will re-render that component, that part of the page, to show whatever the updated state is. And you can see it's not refreshing the entire page. I'm not having to refresh the entire page to display these values. So this is a very big advantage of React and state. If I were to pass these two values down into a component, both clicks and set clicks, it would work the same way. They would still be stateful variables. If I use set clicks and clicks, it will still set the clicks and update that value. So that's kind of one of the useful parts of React, and actually one of the biggest parts. Yes, how can you change the value of clicks to declared const? That's because this is actually, so there's a lot going on behind the scenes when I set this equal to this function use state. Even though clicks is a constant value, use state is creating, it creates this value clicks that cannot be updated by itself, and then it creates a way to update clicks, which is set clicks. So if I use set clicks to update that, that's what actually is forcing the state to re-render. Set state. Yes. Okay. So that's a really great question. So someone in here has used React before. What I'm showing you guys is the newer way to use React. It's something called React hooks. I won't get too much into it, but in old React code, you might see something called class or something .set state. That was the old way of doing things in React. It was really messy. Instead of declaring a component like function app, anytime you wanted to use state, you would have to declare this as a class. And it basically did nothing. It just was the only way you were able to use state. It was a very messy solution. So eventually the people over React is an open source project, but it's kind of guided by Facebook. They decided to update the way they did things, and those are called React hooks. So these hooks are very easy ways to do things. In this case, the hook is use state, and that's creating this state and how I update it. So now there's no more having to declare it as a class. There's nothing else I really have to do. It's just clicks is the state, and then set clicks is how I update that state, and that's it.
One other thing is when JavaScript, constant doesn't mean that the value can never change too. It just means it can't be reassigned. So like if you have a constant object, you can change the value of the object. That's a little trick too.
JavaScript
actually didn't know that,
disgusting. Constant does not mean constant in JavaScript at all.
Yeah, you'll learn JavaScript's. A lot of people don't like JavaScript, justifiably so. It's not a very safe language. There's a lot of messy things, a lot of things that work a certain way but really shouldn't.
Not to mention the error codes are worthless when they try to give you a compiler or something.
Yeah, error codes are very messy. It's very hard to debug JavaScript, which is one of the really nice things about React, because you're creating these separate components for all your bits of code. So if there's some error that happens, it's usually a lot easier to figure out where it's coming from. Like, for example, in my previous example where I had this example component, if an example component I have an error where it says second name is a bad value, I know second name is coming from the parent. I don't have to look at other components in other locations. I know it's something wrong with this component or what's being passed in. So it's kind of easier to track down the problem. So this is two concepts actually. Events and state is what I have shown you guys. So on click, that's called an event. Events aren't specific to React, but this is just a React example. And then state is a React specific thing. And there's just two more quick examples, and I'll go through these a little quicker. And if anyone wants to download this repo as an example, we're going to be making the portfolio website available, and I'll make this demo available. In the console, you would go into the individual projects and write. You first have to do npm install to install things. I did that beforehand because it takes a while. So then you would just npm start after you install everything.
And if you use Yarn, we have it set up with Yarn workspaces too. So if you know what Yarn is and you want to use Yarn, that's really nice.
Yes. As with everything, there's alternatives. NPM has an alternative that's technically a little better, but NPM is the standard one to use, so we didn't want to confuse you guys too much. So here's conditional rendering. So one of the really nice things about React, it's really easy to render certain parts. You can see here, I have a logo, I have some text talking about how nice it is, and a button. If I click the button, the logo disappears and reappears. The page isn't having to refresh for this either, which is really nice. So we're going to go into the classic. So in here, we're going to go into source. You can see I have an index.js file, always best place to start. You can see it's rendering app, so I go straight to app. And in here, I have 2 bits of code. So the nice thing about React is I can combine JavaScript and HTML. So in this function, I can say, I'm going to create a state here. This state's called displayed. So you notice I say displayed and set displayed is equal to use state. And in this case, I pass in an initial value of true. Before it was 0. So in this case, it's true. So that makes this a Boolean. Yes, TypeScript in React is actually really, really nice. But again, for demo purposes, TypeScript would be a little difficult for some people to understand. But if you know TypeScript, TypeScript in React is so nice and fixes a lot of the JavaScript problems. For those of you unfamiliar, TypeScript is just JavaScript with types, so it's a little better. Anyways, you can see here I'm basically saying if displayed, so if this variable is true, then I'm going to return this bit of code, and then otherwise I'm going to return this bit of code. Types. So types are just this is a general programming concept. Types are like an integer or a Boolean or a string or or like a character. Yeah, those are all the different types. If you know something's a string and it's interacted with in a way that a string shouldn't be, it's very easy to say what the error would be. But if in JavaScript where there's no types, it's just I can assign things however I want them and be really lazy. It's hard to know what the problem might be because the code is like, well, maybe he meant to do that weird thing because, whatever can happen can happen.
Yeah, it's loosely typed versus TypeScript is a more strictly typed. So
Yeah.
it will enforce a type. So in TypeScript, if you say that, if we were at the old one, if you say the clicks was an integer, then if you do not give it an integer, it will error. It will error during the compile time because it traces what you do.
So yeah, coming from C++, you would probably be very surprised by how loose JavaScript can be. There are not a lot of limitations on what you can do, for better or worse. Usually worse. Yeah. So here, like I was saying before, it's just so I'm saying if it's displayed, display this thing, return. For those of you who might have caught on, there's always a return statement in these functions, and whatever is returned is what's normally displayed. So I'm going to return this bit of code, and otherwise I'm going to return this bit of code. And if you notice, there's the button here, and on clicking the button, I'm just setting displayed to the opposite of whatever it currently is. So if it's true and I click it, it's set to false, and if it's false, it's set to true. So this is called conditional rendering. It's a really easy way to just render different, like maybe you want someone to hide certain parts of the page or do some. Yes. So actually, just really quickly, if anyone's curious, this is all by default when you do create React app. This is.
I take that back.
Actually,
I don't know if it's actually keyframes. Sorry.
It is keyframes. Yeah. So this is This is the CSS for anyone who's curious. Like I said, ignore it if you don't want to deal with it for now. For those of you who are interested, this is the default create React app. It's spinning the logo, which is a nice little trick.
One thing that I think you might have missed, Dakota, is when you use state, the value you pass use state is the initial state. I'm not sure if you mentioned that.
I don't know, but yes, it's a really good point. Whatever you pass in here is what it's initially created as. Yeah, I don't like CSS. Anyways, now something you might notice is this is very messy. If I ask someone to read this code, they wouldn't very quickly be able to tell what's going on. This is a situation we might want to use a component. So I could take this entire return statement, and instead I could just say I'm going to create a component here that's going to do some stuff. Maybe I want to say, okay, I'm going to create a new file. This is logo on. Wait, which would it be? Yeah, logo on. I create a new file called logo on. I'm going to create a function, name it logo on. I'm just going to paste that bit of code in there.
You need the state in your props.
Export. Oh, and the other thing is if you're so this is kind of a JavaScript thing as well. If I'm importing something, I need to export it from that file. So in here, I would just say export logo on. Default. And you have to write default in React if you're just doing it normally. And then in here, this is a good example of when I need to use props. So in here, I'm using the state displayed and set displayed. So from app, I would say I'm gonna use logo on. And again, a very nice part about using a good editor is it auto completes for me. So it just automatically imports that. Otherwise, I can just, if I didn't have a good editor, I could just write up here, import logo on from in the file location. But here, I'm going to pass in a couple variables. Why is this angry? Oh. There we go. So, sorry. So I'm going to return this single component called logo on. I'm going to pass in the values. I'm going to say displayed is equal to displayed, and then set displayed is equal to set displayed. So now I'm calling this component. I'm passing these values in. And then if I go to that component, I can say, I kind of be lazy, so I'm just going to say props. So it can be props dot, and then props dot. Cool. So now if I go back, you can see this is much easier to read. So now I can just say, so if displayed, I'm going to show this component logo on. And then down here, I'd probably do the same thing, logo off. And it makes things much, much nicer. So that's kind of an example of when you might want to create other components. And then, so you guys don't have to listen to me all night. I'm at the very end, don't worry. The last one is going to be...
I think we're going to skip the routing one.
You want to? Cool. So that's it. It's all the basics of React.
So before we move on, does anyone have any questions about that just dump of content that they just heard? Like, feel free, because that was just a lot of information. Also, if you don't have any questions today, feel free to just drop them in the Discord at any time. There's people more than happy enough to help you with any sort of projects or any questions that you have.
Never forget that the best way to learn React is to build a website. So if you want to get working on your personal website, that's a great way to test it out.
Yes. And that is actually a good segue into the next part.
So Logan, I think you're going to do this next section, right?
Yep. Hey guys. So just real quick, we're going to touch on some reasons why you want to build a portfolio website. And right here, we've just got some tips very upfront. Your resume is something short that you're supposed to hand across the desk to everybody. It's going to ping a lot of bells inside an automated system, but it doesn't really explain who you are to a company or to a recruiter. Now, you can see on the right, I have some sort of fancier profiles for people, but if you have an actual portfolio website, that's going to be a very personal way that you can be like, hey, I'm different than everybody else who's got, a 3.75 GPA from the University of Florida coming out with a computer science degree. You can be like, hey, I'm that guy, or I'm that girl, I'm that guy, and I have my own website. So you send this to them, you just have a link on your resume, and anybody can go to it and learn more about you. It also gives you a place to talk more about what projects you've worked on, and just explain why you are good for their job. All right, next slide. Now, what goes on a portfolio website? You're always going to want to have a little bio, and that's going to explain who you are, that you are in person. This is basically a long form reCAPTCHA. And it will also tell them, it's a great place to talk about soft skills. So if you have something that says, oh, I like to work with others when when I was in college, I was in the open source club. That just shows your recruiter that you're somebody who isn't just going to curl up in their cube. You're actually going to reach out to other people and like you're going to want to learn, and that's what recruiters are looking for. You can also list out your education and your experience. Now, keep in mind that your experience isn't just, oh, I had a job here or I had a job there. Your experience is anything that can make you more valuable to a team. So if you've done like volunteer work, or if you were doing something with a organization on campus, student government thing, those kinds of things can also go in your experience section, help you bulk it up to stand out more. We made sure to mention you don't want to copy and paste your resume. You already handed them your resume, and now they've gone to your website, so they don't want to read that again. Coming from a complete total beginner, would you recommend looking at React tutorials for, oh, that's for Dakota. That's not for me. You're going to want to list out some of your top skills, and we're going to show you a really cool way to do that. There's a bunch of different things you can do. You can, rate them on a 5-star scale if you wanted to. Just something to, little buzzword there, little buzzword there, fun stuff. And projects. I mentioned this before, but you're definitely going to want to explain, why you did a project, what skills you were working on, all sorts of stuff. But your projects are going to be the thing that takes you from, just somebody who's qualified to the recruiter shortlist. Next slide. Okay. How can you show off your projects? All right. Always blog post. This is something I totally agree with. When I was a freshman here, somebody in my class, I was taking like a computer science class, they actually sent me a link to their own blog to answer a question I had. And I thought that was the most Chad thing I'd ever seen in my life. Because first of all, he made this whole website, and instead of just like giving me a short answer, he was like, oh yeah, I actually wrote about this in the past. Here you go. And that's a really big benefit of doing the blog style post, is that, people can see that you're thinking about what you're doing. You're not just, oh, off the cuff, you're like, oh yeah, this would be great. No, it's like, I've actually done the research, and here it is in something that you can read in 5-10 minutes. We also have 3 different, things that you can also display on there. Your GitHub link is just going to be something, and on GitHub, they very prominently display your README for your repository. And, always fill that out. Don't get lazy, talk about the project in there, because not only is that going to make it a more interesting project overall, but you might attract attention from people just, searching the GitHub, or I believe GitHub repositories even pop up on Google if they're public. Video demonstrations. This is one, you can do a video, or, if you want to display something very easily, you don't have to speak during it. You can just do a GIF. I believe you can convert OBS, or you can have OBS record GIFs for you. And if you don't want to set up OBS, you can even open PowerPoint. Just Google how to screen record with PowerPoint. And that, it works. I've turned in a lot of things where, they were like, make a GIF of what you're trying to do. And I just recorded it with PowerPoint and turned it in. And it converts it to a GIF too, which is really nice. And hard mode is project website integration. This is going to be mostly if you're doing something that's web-based in the first place, obviously. But you can also take one of your projects, like, for example, we have a project where we hit YouTube's API to collect some information on different YouTubers. And if we wanted to integrate that into a website to just be like, oh yeah, my script's great, you can test it out here. You can set that up. You can make a RESTful API, which, I'm sure we're going to talk about that at some point this semester. And then you can just have your website ping your API, And then you're not only a web developer, you're not only a Python developer, you're a, you know, you're basically a golden god to a recruiter, because there are very few people that are going to have something like that on their website coming out of school. And that's really what your portfolio website is about. It's about making you stand out in a crowd, especially now that, since we've had COVID, a lot of jobs have become nationwide searches. And that's very good in terms of, you have more options open available to you. However, you're also competing against everybody in the country now. So this website is going to help you stand out. And Hunter, I believe, is going to show you a little template website that we have for you guys if you want to build it out for yourself.
Yeah, so what we're going to talk about next is just building off of what Dakota did. We came up with just like a simple website. I mean, it's not the fanciest. If you look up like developer websites, don't be shocked if you see like all these like cool animations, graphics, colors, and everything. This is just a simple one. And it's just a starting place if you wanted to build off, or if you just want to see like a code for like an example of one, or you can just code completely from scratch, build your own, use the framework that you want to learn or whatever. And if you clone the repo, or if you're just clicking through it, it's the last one, the final portfolio. And so I'm going to show it hosted on our club server. And so we're going to talk about hosting in a bit, but for just reference, this is an Nginx hosting on our own club server. And basically what we have is your name, a picture. You can have your bio here. You can get the links to your social media if you have if you tweet about software, or if you have like a GitHub account, or like a LinkedIn you want to plug, different things like that. So, I mean, a simple thing just showing about the state. We have like a clickable skills, using those same events the same way. Let's see, we have education. You can put your school's logo, you can put your degrees, your time period. Say you went to MIT in the year 1000, maybe this is what you have. You can talk about what you did at school. You can talk about maybe you had a minor in business or a master's. And then we can go into like experience. So maybe you did Java work at Ancient Corp for 10 days. You can talk about your GitHub actions. You can talk about AWS code pipeline. And actually, Twitter does actually have a lot of developers on it. Like if you have a programming language, just search your programming language on Twitter and you'll find like 50 million developers. If you want to want to talk about like a certain company, like I follow a bunch of AWS developers that like work for AWS too. You can find sort of any sort of like niche target community in Twitter. Let's see. So then we go to projects. So say you have like a header. You can talk about your projects. You can open a link to your project, different things like that. And this is just our very simple like portfolio website. We hit most of the main things. You can go into details. We have, this is called like a scroll spy, so you can see which component you're on. And then I'm going to just go really quickly through the code because we're a little like at time. And so let's go to the code. So let's do as Dakota has been saying this whole time is we'll start at the index. And so this one, instead of just having app, we have a few components. We have a header, we have the main view, we've got the side links, and we've got a footer. Let's just start at the header. So in the header, what I did was I didn't want to copy and paste. So like just as a thing. So say if you want to build out like a nav bar and you have all these nav links. So as you can see here, we have all these nav links on the right here. I really didn't want to copy and paste them all. So I just put them in an array of like JavaScript objects, and I just mapped them all to a function or to a component. And so this is getting into more of like JavaScript language semantics with like .map just lets you take each value in an array and turn it into a new value. And React will render each of these as its own HTML. So here's the function that I used. I just turned it into the list item. And if you get more into like HTML, these are anchor links or just for different types of links. So both on our website and across. Also, I forgot to mention, this is a Bootstrap 5 website. So that's just a CSS framework and some JavaScript that allows you to do some of the common styling. And so if you wanted to make this nav bar, it's as easy as making the class nav bar dark, like sticky top so it stays to the top, and it does it all for you. It's also extendable, and I added a link to that in the README for this part of the website. So let's go back and we'll go through it. Let's go to our main view. Here we just have our divs for dividing out the different sections of our home, our skills, education, employment, and projects. And really, this is just a template. Like I said, you can start here go off, create your own, do whatever you want with it. One of the things, we can go into each of these components. And so home is just a simple component. All it does is just return basic HTML. Let's go back to skills. And so skills, we get a little bit more of the things that we've learned across the way. So what I did is I put the skills in an array so that if someone wanted to come take this site and add their own skills, all they would have to do is just copy one of these and fill it out with their own information. It's real simple. And here's how it works. So we have a state, and our state starts off with null because there's no skill selected, but the state is just the current skill that someone has clicked on. Because as we see here, if you click on it, it pulls the information down to that bottom box. And so what that does is we set an on click for that, and we have the on click set the skill to the current skill that we're outputting. I also wanted 2 columns, so I just took the first half of the list and put it on the left, and took the second half and put it on the right. Let's see. So there's also some weird JavaScript things. I'm sorry for putting this in here, but what this does is this and just checks to make sure that these values exist before it will output the right side of an OR statement. It's a weird JavaScript thing, but you might run into this. So if you see like an OR, if this is true, it will output the right side of the value, or sorry, if this is false, it will output the right side of the value. And on this part, if this is true, it'll output the right side if it's also true. It's just a weird way that JavaScript works. Okay, so let's go back to our main. We'll go through education. And here I did the same thing. We have our education info. It's an object. You have different bullet values if you wanted to. You can add the badges with the your different parts of the thing. So if we see here, that's this part. And here we go into some more complex components. So we start off with a section, and you say, oh, what's a section? So we'll open up section. And what that is it's just a simple thing. So we don't have to repeat it in different components. We just put it here once. It's write once, then use it everywhere else. Or like a dry principle, don't repeat yourself. So if you find yourself repeating yourself a lot, you can create a component to do the same thing. Let's see. If we go back to education, we'll see that we took that education info and we did the same mapping. So we took each item in there and we turned it into something else. And in this case, we're turning it into an info component. So if we go to the info component, we'll see the same thing we've been seeing over and over again. These are the props that are coming in. These are just the basic HTML. And there's even more nested components. So as you see, React, you just get more and more components. And you can just follow them to see what it is. So in this case, it's just a simple function that, returns it with another function. It will map all the different items. Let's see. So let's see. What would anyone? Does anyone have any questions or want any explanations on anything with this, or have any questions in general, or any questions on back to hosting or domains, anything like that?
If anyone's kind of intimidated by this, just remember that it's almost exactly what we were talking about with the demo, just with slightly more, right? Maybe there's a few more tags inside, a little bit more of code, but the general layout, the general ideas, they're all the same, just bigger.
Stack Overflow probably has some helpful resources for you as well as you're going along.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the slides so we can just talk about hosting real quick. And so there's some free options like GitHub with GitHub Pages, or Heroku, or someone else said Netlify. I can't say it correctly. Or let's see, some other ones are Google Firebase is a really good one. And then there's some paid options. So what we use is a DigitalOcean Droplet. We just pay monthly for a server. And this actually, if you wanted to, you could get a lot of experience with Unix commands, hosting servers, but it's really just like the tough road ahead. If you would just want a simple server, I would just go with like a Heroku would probably be the easiest option if you just wanted to host a website quickly. Another thing is also with AWS S3, you could host a static website in S3. You can even put like a CloudFront CDN, get real fast website if you wanted to. But really, just stick with the free options. And then if you want your own domain, a lot of them will let you bring your own domain. I use Google Domains for my hosting. If you want like a .com, it's like $10 a year or $12 a year. So it's like $1 a month, basically. You get it for a year. Other than that, we have some additional resources about deploying React, our portfolio websites, examples. And thank you. Are there any last minute questions? Anyone want to talk about anything? Have any questions about what we did or anything like that? Well, I mean, if no one has any questions, we can go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you all for coming.
Well, hold on. Sorry,
Okay, yeah,
just quickly.
sorry. Yeah.
One question. Exciting. Getting started is one of the hardest thing in like programming. It's a little different for everyone. I think in general though, the best thing you can do is just find a project you're really interested in, whether one you want to start or work on. So if you find a really cool project that you want to clone and look through, that works for some people. For me, if I'm not starting a project or working on it myself, I can't get into it. I had a friend who, for some reason, his favorite thing to do was just read books, like textbooks on programming. So he just bought like the actual like C++ like textbooks and stuff and read those. And he was really smart, so that worked for him. But everyone's a little different. Everyone's a little different. I think it's important to find what works for you. So it's definitely worth try to find a fun project, clone it, see how that works. Maybe just try starting a project. Find a tutorial on YouTube where maybe someone walks you through building a basic website in React, and maybe follow along and see, oh, I really like this. I'm going to continue this project or start a new one. Or I think that's a really good place to start.